just want to welcome everybody, everybody out there watching. We're real excited for this event, for an upcoming book, Designing Relationally, Making and Restoring Life. So we're real excited to have some distinguished panelists here and respondents, and I will turn it over now to Professor Rita Sherma of the Center for Dharma Studies here at the Graduate Theological Union to do an initial introduction here.
Thank you for being with us. Delighted to have you. We are very honored and privileged to have with us Professor Arturo Escobar, Michal Osterweil, Kriti Sharma, and Clive Dilnot, and Christopher Key Chapple. Welcome all of you. And I want to just give you just the premise of this event, which is part of our larger Sustainability 360 and Sustainable Societies initiative at the GTU. It is regarding a book that Professors Arturo Escobar, Michal Osterweil, and Kriti Sharma are working on, titled Designing Relationally, Making and Restoring Life. And yes, it is about redesigning in terms of interrelationality. The book asks the question, if we took seriously the premise that all things are radically interdependent, what would we design and create in our world here in the midst of the intersecting and escalating social and ecological crises of the 21st century? And how would we do it? So we have the three authors who will go through the book and its seminal premise and how it's been structured, what it seeks to address. And then we will have responses from Professor Clive Dilnot, who is a professor of design studies at the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons New School for Design. And we will have a second response from Professor Christopher Key Chapple, Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology and founding director of the Master of Arts and Yoga Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Professor Chapple is a pioneer in the field of worldviews and ecology in its many and variegated forms. And we are very pleased to have all of you with us. I now turn it over to Michal Osterweil.
Hi, thank you, Rita, and thank you for inviting us. And hi, Herman. So great to have you. Arturo sent you his personal link, so you are now part of the panel.
And hello to Christopher. It's great to see you.
Yeah. All right, so I'm going to take liberties here and start in a way that we tend to start the project that this book emerges from, and also in the spirit of relationality. So I'm just going to ask us all to take a moment and feel our feet on the ground and our bums on a chair. If we are sitting on a chair, with Zoom now, we could be in all sorts of positions. So wherever you have contact, just feel that. Just take a couple of moments to get grounded, to feel your body, to remember that you are not just a buzzing caffeinated head. I'm speaking to myself, obviously. And if you want, just give yourself some squeezes on your shoulders, on your quads. One of the primary dualities that I think those of us in this sphere, the academy and related, is the, whole duality between the mind and the body. So it feels like a very important place to start, to just remember that we are both, and we're also heart. So that we can invite a couple of breaths right there too, because part of what this project is about, and that's what I'm here to talk about for a few minutes, is just the origins of the project, is about sort of bridging the divide between mind, body, but also the exclusion of a heart-centered logic in the way we think about social change and design and making worlds. So with that, I am going to tell you briefly about the material chronological sort of process of this book, as well as the intellectual roots of it. But I also, as I was preparing these notes, I was also moved to mention another dimension, which is the creational relational. And I should say that the book has been a really long time in coming, and I guess most books are, but this one, because of the lovely collaboration of which it is a product, and that the thing about that collaboration is it's a process of learning to think, write, know relationally between three individuals, myself, Arturo, Escobar, and Kriti, Sharma, but who have many, many affinities and many, many differences, but also all of the webs of ideas, experiences, and people and non-humans that comprise each of us. So it's just been a really beautiful process, and I want to thank my collaborators. And I was going to say this later, but I'll just say this now, that even if we fail to actually finish this book, the process has been so meaningful and also generative that it would be enough. But I hope we finish it. So materially, the book actually arose out of a seminar that Arturo, Escobar, and myself began in 2011 called the Carolina Seminar on the Theory and Politics of Relationality. And that was it was 2011, and it officially continues today. We are still doing some projects, and we'll have a couple of events this year, but it has sort of gone more into this phase of getting this book out. But the seminar was a transdisciplinary, Herman was a major part of it. It was a transdisciplinary space in which we really engaged readings, ideas, and events. And we were shocked, Arturo and I were shocked the first time we put out the call, and over 45 people showed up in our little classroom on the third floor of Alumni Hall, an anthropology room. And it was on the back of the heels of another working group that Arturo and I had both been very, very involved in and probably co-led since its inception in 2003, which was called the Social Movement Working Group. And that working group was a mix of graduate students and faculty from a number of departments that really wanted to look at social movements not simply as sociological objects of study, but as knowledge producers in their own right. And knowledge producers in their own right that they were helping to theorize the political and social change. And that was a very fruitful and important source for many of the ideas that then became the seminar on the theory and politics of relationality. And then for a few different reasons, and I think each of us have slightly different reasons for it, we started to run into this bigger theme. I want to call it a little bit bigger because it was about coming into the knowledge, both in a negative sense of coming up against the limits of a non-relational or a dualist ontology in many, many spheres, in particular in the political and in the visions of change that social movements were working from, but not only. And at the same time, the positive experience of witnessing the emergence of a new logic, a new political logic from places like social movements, but also in the sphere of business, in the sciences, in various places, right? And then thirdly, and I think this is an element that we keep coming up against and we have to discuss more, and it turns out it will be centered in the book. At the same time, both Arturo and myself had started to have more energy and attention for what you might call spiritual practices or the role of the sacred through meditation, yoga, and also the recognition in particular for myself of the absence or like even about it prior. So that category and its effects, not just the category, but the practices, were a large source and impetus for the kind of work that we did together. So then we began teaching a course called Social Change in Times of Crisis, Knowledge, Action, and Ontology, and had just years of very fruitful and convivial discussion. And I say convivial because really just like the writing process has been for me, and I had missed it so much. It was this space of just energy and excitement and thinking and sharing food while we think. And it was in that process that we also met, well, re-met, because we already knew Kriti, who was a biologist and a Buddhist, a very established practice. And if you haven't seen her brilliant book, Interdependence, Biology and Beyond, I really want to recommend it. So out of that came many, many years of different themes, different sources, different readings. And then we often talked about, we need to write a book, we need to do something. And finally in 2019, largely because of Arturo's involvement with Clive in a series on designing in dark times, we just took it on. So I'm going to leave it there. If there's time later, I wanted to share snippets of a collage poem that Kriti put together after one of the more intense periods of our process, just when we were trying to figure out not only what is the book and what is it about, but what do we want it to do in the world, right? So if we have time later, I'll read a little snippet from that because it was really helpful to me to review that. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Arturo, who was going to start talking about the precepts of the book itself. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, Michal, for the introduction. Thanks, Rita and Matthew, Chris and Clive and Kriti and Michal and everybody who is joining us. Herman as well, who's been part of this journey, and for being here. And what I like to do is, I have to put some light on, I don't know, my face probably looks really illuminated, is to give you a sense of how I arrived at the question of relationality, and how, when I did so, I had a sense of arriving at something that was very fundamental. And I like to try, I like to take that as an entry point for talking about the book, and especially about the theory dimension of the book. Okay, so I grew up in Cali, Colombia, and I studied chemical engineering. This is going to be very short. I'm going to summarize my intellectual life in about 3 minutes. Kind of scary, but that's the way it goes. And I was particularly concerned by the end of my undergraduate in '75 with the problem of hunger and malnutrition in the world. So naively, I wanted to use science and technology, biochemical engineering in particular, for graduate work to contribute to solve the hunger crisis. In a way, that was an early awareness of how design is so central to the making of the world. So there was a number of steps from then on until arriving at relationality, almost, 30 years later, that goes more or less as follows. So hunger, obviously, was a question of power and domination and capitalism. So I began to study political economy of hunger and development. And from there, then move on to talking about underdevelopment as the larger phenomenon, and the political economy of underdevelopment, and then post-development. And then the question of, and resistance to development by social movements. And then this new phase for me was the analysis of development as a hegemonic discourse for the systematic production and control of what was called the third world, most of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and the notion of post-development. The next phase was then moving from this analysis of development discourse and post-development to the concern with the ecological crisis. And I've been working for the past 20 years very much on that. And the field, what we call political ontology, a field that is a nascent field but growing field that focuses very much on the shortcomings of understanding social reality and problems on the basis of the separation between the human and the non-human, the sort of the dualism between the human and the non-human, between culture and nature, and so forth. And then finally arriving at a different way of understanding life and the earth today. So I sort of went from hunger to underdevelopment, to resistance to development and post-development, to ecology, and finally to earth and life itself. And that was the opening the door to relationality. And how did it happen? Two things. First, I was always concerned through all these different phases with two issues. The question of difference, what's happening to difference, how the world is becoming increasingly homogenized. And second, obviously, the question of social justice. But especially of relevance for the book was becoming increasingly aware of the limitations of modern social theory to give us a significant understanding of relationality. Is something that really didn't happen for me, at least, even in post-structuralism, no matter how brilliant post-structuralist analysis was. So I want to take that then as the entry point for talking about the part of the book that for us is very important, which is that insufficiency of modern social theory to help us arrive at a genuine understanding of life as relational in terms of radical interdependence, but in two different ways. There was a twofold emphasis that we have in the book, which is the first one is that the fact that how this modern social theory has been so central to shaping the story of life with which we live, and the story of life out of which we produce the world, we create societies, we design the world. But also then how those shortcomings can be transcended, how can we move beyond those limitations to really illuminate the fact that life really is not based on the basis of ontological separations and dualisms, but more in terms of radical interdependence of everything that exists. So what we do in the book, in part of the book, is to follow these twofold interests. On the one hand, how social theory has shaped the dominant story of life, and how we can re-story life and redesign life on the basis of a different understanding with a different set of tools from maybe a different social theory. And we do that by studying systematically 4 different domains. The first one is the domain of thought itself, modern social theory. The second is the domain of the human. The third is the domain of the secular and the sacred, or the sacred. And the fourth domain is the domain of life. And of these domains, within each of one of these domains, we ask the question of what does the dominant story tell us about thought, human, life, the sacred? And then what does it that it leaves out of the elements that leaves out that are so central to life, to the production of life in the world. And I only have about 1 minute left, so I'll just emphasize that one of the things that we deal with, and we thought that it was very important for us to give our best synthesis, if you wish, of the problem of that is causing this mess in which we live today, and how it is connected to theory. And along the way, we found different ways of talking about the limitations of modern social theory, and then about ways to transcend them. So that's what you can expect from the book, from that part of the book. And we're really excited about doing this together. And now I'll pass it on to Kriti.
Thank you, Arturo. Really delighted to be here with you all. I am a biologist. I work currently at Caltech studying microbes at the bottom of the ocean. And I'm lucky to be in conversation with such wonderful authors and scholars. And we're really particularly excited to be here with you all here at GTU. I think I speak for all of us when I say that we're excited about this specific audience and that engages so deeply with these foundational questions of existence, ontology, the sacred, and of personal and social transformation. So I'm thinking of this like a lab meeting, which is what we tend to do in the sciences, is quite regularly we'll give each other updates in a given lab group. And the point is not to give a polished story or a finished story, but to say, what directions are we excited about? What's our kind of pilot data? And where are we struggling? Where could we use some help or other minds helping us think through some places where we're stuck? And in that spirit, I feel like we are excited to be hopefully finished with the launch of this book, or a draft of this book, by the summer. And in the interim have just had so many interesting puzzles to work through. it has been a really exhilarating exercise to try and write this book. And it's also been some of the most difficult writing that I've done. And part of it, as I have told Arturo and Michal, is because we're talking about living between worlds and sort of writing for people who are between worlds, in a sense, that because we identify as people who have been constituted, who has been made through society, through the current dominant story of life that we're in, as um, as the sort of rational, liberal, modern, usually Eurocentric subject who tends to think of themselves, this dominant story of life is that we're primarily biological beings. It's a Darwinian story. And that one of the most important things about being a biological being, it's not just that we're biological beings, but what biology has come to mean is the struggle for survival and a primarily economic view of the biological, that what life is really a struggle for resources and a um, just an uphill battle against scarcity. And this can be, we draw a lot on a really wonderful theorist, Jamaican cultural theorist, Sylvia Wynter, who was a professor at Stanford and is now continuing to write in her 90s, having since retired from Stanford. And she has done really beautiful work on kind of tracking how we got here from the conquest of the Americas in the 1500s and what our modern episteme is sort of depended on. And she talks about three major revolutions or she talks about the natural sciences as kind of a succession of heresies, that there was the Copernican revolution that brought about the idea of a kind of rational man, then the Darwinian revolution, which is the episteme that we're sort of living in today, where we see ourselves as primarily bioeconomic. And she sees us as sort of on the verge of another kind of becoming another kind of being who could potentially get beyond the story of humans as and life as primarily bioeconomic. And this sounds easy, as in when we say we live inside a story, it sounds like we could just decide to tell another story. But part of the promise and the challenge is that we can, in fact, make ourselves anew, in a sense, as Alexis Pauline Gumbs, a wonderful Black feminist theorist and poet, says, because our words do make our worlds. But also, as Sylvia Wynter points out, as heterodox biologists Francisco Varela and Humberto Maturana pointed out, the stories that we tell about ourselves will work on us biologically, which means that we really experience ourselves in a way, when we go against our foundational and original, in a way, origin stories, that we experience ourselves as very near death, that we have these profound aversive reactions to changing our stories of ourselves at that level. And to kind of illustrate that, I would say, I think about sort of how for myself, even every day, despite the fact that I might not intellectually believe that we live in a world that is really characterized by scarcity and struggle at its foundation, somehow I still find myself worrying a lot about whether or not I'm going to get by or whether I'm going to survive. And this makes sense because the stories that we've made have made it true that people who fall outside that story may in fact fall outside of the circle of care, such that we do have to continue to struggle within the story in order to survive, in a way. So it's a real knot, and to put it lightly. And we really are wanting to, first of all, sort of frame this knot to show the loop, what we have talked about as toxic loops, or the tendency of systems of thought and of being to repeat themselves and to self-reinforce positive feedback loops, as we might say in biology, that just perpetuate themselves. And the way to kind of get out of these loops is not simple, but because these cycles are made up of many intersecting systems, the best thing to do is to try and interrupt them in many places at once. So that's why we're thinking on these different levels about thought, about life, about the sacred, about politics. And we hope to intervene by both exposing the kind of story of life that we're in, trying to tell different stories. And in this sense, we see this question of design as not just a question. We usually think of design as how to create objects or landscapes or architecture that is going to somehow technologically help within our current paradigm. But design could also be thought of as designing new stories. And in that sense, designing our very selves and our very society, because that is actually what we are doing all the time through the ways in which we narrate to ourselves who we are and narrate to each other, and therefore make more real to each other what kind of world we live in. So with that, I will pass it over to Michal, and I'm so excited to discuss with you all soon.
Yeah, so we've tried to keep our comments initially brief so that we can talk more amongst ourselves. So I'm just going to start with that last bit about designing new stories, because I think one of the places the project emerges here, but also that we've come up against when we've been doing this writing, that is one of the easiest and most challenging places to see the problematic of relationality is in social change, or what we might call the history of social movement practice. And one of the things that we, just as an ethic of our own writing and our own concept making practice, one of the things that we really want to stress is that we believe that we are trying to make it easier for social movements and other world makers to valorize and explain to skeptical others the work that they are doing. And this is because, unlike the modernist or dualist ontology that we are, as Kriti just described, in the toxic loop and have a difficult time escaping from even as we criticize it, a relational lens recognizes that the world is enacted and made stronger through the stories that we tell and the meanings that we make, right? So one of the things, and this is sort of where I want to start talking about the section on the political, one of the things that we have observed time and time again is that throughout the 20th century, possibly before, but our examples really center on the 20th century, there have been these moments of the emergence of these collective effervescent moments of a new kind of politics. Even at times, and the first example that, for those who read the excerpt that I point to, is actually in the civil rights movement that we tend to think of in a pretty traditional lens. But every time there's this like social movement effort, like about to change the world, right? People get really, really excited about it, sometimes without even being able to conceptually explain it. And new ideas come up, there's this like elation. But then time and time again, there is this ending in either complete sort of dismissal, oh, that was just frivolous, that was just too small, that was a failure, or that was just too radical. I mean, that was unrealistic. There is no way that was going to actually change the world, right? And this puzzle of why we keep seeing these world-changing movements that we think are world-changing at their moment, and then the sort of reversion to a dismissal for either this reason of like it being just too small, not actually registering change, illegible, like we don't make sense of it. So there's been a lot of reference to movements as just silly or playful or cultural or micro-political as denigrations of them. And, or on the other hand, just dismissing them as being too radical. So this puzzle of why that is has been really emergent. Another puzzle, and these are the two places that I sort of that take our writing on the politics of it, is there has been this tendency to have very beautiful visions, imaginaries, new theories in the practice of making social change. And then in the practice, the coming up against the old egoic is one way to put it, or logocentric, patriarchal, machista, white supremacist versions of reality in the practice. So we might have these very sophisticated or just lovely theories and new political imaginaries. And then in the practice, we see recapitulations of these old forms of behavior, of exclusion, of, you know, a lot of things. And if this is too abstract, please ask me questions about this, because there are a lot of concrete examples I can give, but I'm trying to be very brief. And as my colleagues know, that is not my strong suit. So, so these two dimensions, right, of dismissing movements, of failure, calling them failures, but also of coming up against, and I will say as someone who studied the alter globalization movement at various places, in particular, I spent a lot of time in Italy, but also at sites like the Zapatista Encuentros and also the World Social Forum and counter summit protests against the G8 or the WTO. I witnessed, again, personally, this idea of both the coming up against the dualist or the bigger than just a capitalist white supremacist politics, but also the emergence of these new politics, and then this pattern of dismissing, right, or of recapitulating really problematic practices, right? So one of the things that we argue in this book, and this argument has gone through many iterations in my own thinking and Arturo's thinking, and Kriti has helped us because it's all been a collective process, has been shifting from understanding this as a new political imaginary or a new culture of politics, which was part of the way that a lot of us were thinking about it before, to recognizing that part of why this keeps happening is because there is a slippage, right? Or that you can talk about it as a slippage or being trapped by what we term modernist default settings. And those modernist default settings, and default settings are like the water we swim in, right? They are, they're there, but we're not really aware of them, right? So they're deeper than ideas or ideologies. And they might, some of them can seem political, but even our conception of an autonomous individual, right? Or notions then like justice or inclusion are affected by many of these modernist default settings. And the modernist default settings that relate to the 4 domains that Arturo already mentioned, in particular, this idea of the autonomous individual, which interestingly lends itself to a slippage when we think about its opposite, the collective, because the collective from a relational lens is not simply the coming together of a bunch of autonomous individuals. It's ontologically different. So, as well as the linear progressive notions of time, which are closely linked to development and progress, as well as a linear cause and effect notion. So if we think about political effectivity and in that linear dimension of time, we're thinking, you make a demand, you win the demand, or you lose the demand, right? And lots of other iterations of that. And then the rational scientific form of knowing that is related to both of those, that privilege the mind and objective reality. And so all of these work together to produce a rather limited definition of the political and of political effectiveness. So the project of one of the sections of this book is to really go through some of these slippages or the ways that we remain trapped or that movements remain trapped. And when I say we, what we want to say is like it's part of the process of being between these two stories. So it's not that the other story is completely wrong. It's just that it has blind spots because it's operating at one domain of reality. And those blind spots like really are blind spots. And so we keep them, and the interesting thing is how we don't realize that we carry the blind spot to that other dimension, and then that other dimension doesn't make sense. I hope that was logical. So some of the examples that we're looking at are many indigenous social movements and the work of indigenous scholars. The Zapatistas have been very important influences in the theorizing that we've been doing. Also many abolitionist movements, actually abolitionist politics that are becoming much more known right now with the Black Lives Matter moment that we are living in. But that is one of the most potent examples to me of a relational non-dualist politics, because they recognize that, most abusers were abused. So it's not simply about, right, it's not good guys versus bad guys. It's a systemic problem in which you have to very delicately and very processually address multiple dimensions of this. There's also an emergent network, and I say emergent, although it's many years it's an emergence of people that came out of the alter globalization and feminist and anti-capitalist and anti-racist activism, in particular in the United States, is who I've studied, that call themselves spiritual activists or transformational organizers. They've also used the language of deep change, and perhaps something that's more linked to abolition, which is healing justice, which is linking an epistemology and framework of healing rather than revolution, right? Or in addition to, let's say, not rather, because that would be dualism again. So I think I'm going to leave it there. But just this idea that part of the problem with the political is needing to wrest it from its modernist default settings and recognize it more in its holistic project for making life, right? And so some of the projects that we're going to argue are political, are small and about world and life making in the present, whether it's building gardens or gaining agency over your healthcare. There's places that it might not be obviously a political movement that we will suggest are part of this larger process. Thank you so much. And I'm really excited to the conversation. I don't know if we said this in here, we said it when we were before. This is our first time sharing any of the writing with anyone besides our editor, who hasn't seen much of this either. So we're really excited. Thanks. Oh, Arturo and Kriti, I don't know if you wanted to add, that was our next step, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes, so we have a few minutes, and I'd like to add a couple of things very briefly. The first one is one of the questions that Sylvia Winter, that Kriti mentioned already, is one of our inspirations for the book. Emphasizes is she wants to provide or convey a different understanding or where we have been in ontological, epistemic, historical, political terms, as a prelude to then thinking about how we can make ourselves anew. And where we have been is, she calls man two, the idea, a particular understanding of man, what she calls a mono-humanist notion of the human. And we really like that, the mono-humanist notion of the human, that we're sort of trapped within this idea of the human as secular, liberal, bourgeois, Western, etc., etc. And that produces, in many ways, the loops of existence that are based on this idea of individuality and a particular understanding of the economy, a particular understanding of science and the real, that have become in many ways toxic because they continue to produce and reproduce the non-relational, or they continue to produce social life on the basis that social life is based on the separations. And precisely then going against that non-relational is what we're trying to come to terms with. But so theory has been so central to this production of non-relationality, modern social theory, because it has been so abstract and leaves out embodiment and experience and many of these different things, because it is based on a universal idea of the human, sort of that enlightened universal man. But there are so many other ways of being human, especially for colonized peoples, don't recognize themselves on that idea of universal man. And because it leaves out its own historicity as a particular way of thinking, and this allows other ways of thinking along the way. So that's what I wanted to add to our conversation so far.
I didn't have anything to add at this point. I liked everything that you all said, and am happy to kind of chime in when we have hear from our respondents or have Q&A.
I'd like to now invite Clive Dilnot to respond, and then Professor Chapple.
Clive, you're muted.
I will. Am I now on? Yes, you can hear me. Somebody's nodding. Good. This is an improvement. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to respond. It's especially interesting because for my sins, I am the editor of this book. So, and as indeed they said, this is really the first time I've seen anything of any substance whatsoever. So this is for me, my God, are they actually going to make something that we can actually print? You know, I think possibly they will, but I'm not sure. But well, I'll explain this. I will explain this. I'm going to focus actually on the text, or a little bit on the text that was sent. I axiomatically do this now, as an editor, rather than. And I'm going to begin simply from the title. And actually to riff on the title, which is designing relationally. And I'm going to try to sort of unpack this as a way of unpacking issues which I think are latent in here. Designing relationally really means designing in a relational manner, but it's really designing for relationality. And we're designing here with a small d. We're not talking about professional design in any way, shape or form. Designing as a human action, a human capacity, let's put it like that. So, and relationality is a very interesting thing because it is not a thing, it is a condition. And this is extremely important, I think, very, very important. I mean, it's interesting that in the 15 or 20 pages we got, there wasn't really an extended definition of relationality, but there was the superb quote, the very, very, I think it was called a very precise quote from Martin Luther King. And if people haven't read this, then what King says, and I actually think he's taking from a quotation from the last paragraph of a piece by Marx written in 1843, Notes on J.S. Mill, where Marx actually does a kind of extended riff of this. But Martin Luther King says this, and if people haven't read it, it might be useful to read. All life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And then he said, in subjective terms, this means I can never be what I ought to be unless you are capable of being what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be unless I am capable of being what I ought to be. This is a beautiful, I mean, this gets to the human essence of it. And then he says, basically, in existential terms, this is the interrelated structure of reality. Now, I take that absolutely literally. You know, I don't think this is exactly it. So this is now, so here we are. So that relationality is the condition of life, the very ultimate condition of life, to the extent that if you no longer have relationality, you no longer have interdependence, death ensures. So the breaking, so that in a sense, the breaking of dependence or relation is the breaking of the conditions which sustain life. And that is the trajectory that we are now on. That is to say, that we are at a point of the almost the absolute converse or negation. Now, what's quite extraordinary about the proposition designing relationality is that you should link these two things. And why would you actually do that? So the idea is that really for the first time, what's being conceived here is that we begin to conceive of making or building what is called the civilizational matrix, terms used in the text quite a bit, not as a supplement to the world, but as the direct articulation of the essential conditions of life. So this is completely different. You are not building a supplement. You're not building that which is on top of. You are actually trying to deal with the conditions of life. You are trying to design for interdependence. You could say that because design always involves consciousness, you are seeking to bring interdependence to consciousness in a way. But more than consciousness, it's not just in the mind, it's in actuality. You are actually trying to build things which enable interdependence or which enhance it or sustain it or in other ways develop it. And here I wanted to give an extraordinary quotation from Elaine Scarry from her book called The Body and Pain, where at one point she says, and it's a wonderful proposition which always staggered me for years when I first read it, but I now think this project is touching on, where she says this. She says, the real ongoing work of civilization is not making X or Y, but making and remaking, making itself, rescuing, restoring, and repairing it to its proper path each time that it threatens to collapse into or become conflated with its opposite. Its opposite is unmaking, that is destructiveness, the unmaking of the conditions for persons alive. So this is, so she says the entire work of civilization at its best is this. Now, so in other words, then, designing relationality is designing on behalf of the conditions on which life depends. And this means that it's deeper than any metaphysics. It's deeper than simply designing for nature. And it's deeper than these two things because it deals with something which is endemic to any interrelationality, which is tensions between its moments. There are always tensions, particularly in artifice. There are always tensions. And so what designing relationality really means, you could interpret it as negotiating the incommensurabilities, which are always involved in any interdependent relation, particularly when there are persons and things and persons and world. And in fact, the appropriateness of using the word designing here is because this is what designing does. It negotiates incommensurabilities. All design is interface, mostly between subject, object, subject and environment, object and environment. It's all interface, and one came from another, which means that there are irreconcilable demands. And how do you negotiate those? And you can only negotiate those in a configuration, in something you make. This is the point. And this configuration is always the incomplete. It's never perfect, can never be. It's a compromise. Every car is a compromise between the incompatibilities of going fast and being safe. And everyone is an incomplete. So now we have here then, so designing relationality is actually kind of dealing with these impossibilities. And once we get that, I think, when we look at this in relationship to the world, we can begin to suddenly see, in a sense, the depth of the conceptual moves that the authors have to make. Because once you set this up, all of a sudden you are dealing with a completely different world, you're a different world. So this is the why, and I think it's on the first page, we have the sort of the proposition that the crises of now depend on a twofold response. One is a revolution in thought, but that revolution in thought is not for itself, it's to build a new civilizational matrix, something which can actually enhance, establish interrelationality. So this is the overall project. And yet, thinking about this project just one more level, it has a peculiar paradox to it. It is, in many ways, a project that operates on the level of what is. So the fundamental premise is that interrelationality is actually of the essence of being, if you see what I mean. And yet it's also operates on the basis of that which is not. In fact, in the world now, which is almost a-relational, almost anti-relational. I wrote that down. I thought of Mrs. Thatcher's famous statement in about 1982, there is no society. There is only individuals or at best a family. There we go, you know, a-relationality at its essence. So now we have then, how on earth then do we start thinking about this problem? And the authors say, well, very clear, the absolute necessity of going beyond the modern, the absolute necessity of that. It's not that you sling every baby out with the bathwater, as it were, but you do bracket the known and the real. You actually accept the insufficiency of modern categories of thought, and even that not only are they insufficient, but they will actively block. They will work to actively block in various forms, in various ways. They will block the emergence of interrelationality. So the second necessity is the parallel need to open up other modes of thought. And the bit that hit me in the 15 or 16 pages, especially I was reading it in sequence, was the idea of refusing the concept of natural scarcity, which I think is a beautiful attack. It's the most, I think it's one of the most powerful attacks we can make. which has its own converse, which is the necessity to articulate an alternative economy, which would not simply be that of plenitude, but it would be something like I would call an economy of reciprocation, where you actually took the premise that what is often projected is infinitely, as it were, less in the energy that it is used to project it than in the reciprocation that it offers. I could think of Shakespeare, the US Constitution, the invention of the alphabet, or Arabic numerals, or whatever. You can think of those where the payback, if you like, is infinitely greater. Can this be turned into a model of the economy? But it's exactly here, when you come to the economy and politics, that it gets really, really difficult, because the problem about categories, modern categories, becomes really crucial. They do not allow such thinking. There's a nice term somewhere in the text where it says our given range of concepts, our language, our imaginary, our categories are simply not capacious enough to hold or make sense of this project. And I think that term capacious is crucial. They are not big enough. They are too small. They are too narrow. I think that term struck me as absolutely crucial here. So, and this again hits the kind of the peculiar paradox of this, that we actually live, and this is what I think Michal was especially speaking to, we live in a sense with relationality. It's the only way we actually exist. Yet in our thought, we are conceptually incapable of grasping it. Even of those moments which are relational, we don't grasp it and we don't give them value. And I was really struck here by the point about civil rights, and the paragraph from, I forget the name of the author, I'm sorry, where she talks about the difference between civil rights as creating the beloved community and civil rights as economic integration. And it's the scale difference between the vastness of the one and in a way, the tininess of the other. And I think that caught that exactly, the incapacity of our, if you put it, I think, modernist default settings to grasp on this, to get hold of it, and sufficiently value. This is crucial, this idea of sufficiently valuing and finding ways to, if you like, give objective force to those things which are in our current discourse are of tenuous value. So this is where you all articulate your need for a paradigm shift in thought, because we're operating, as one line says somewhere, on a totally different plane or phase of reality. So how do we articulate this? And here you come up with a project which is very close to my sort of publisher's heart, of the lexicon. You say one of our goals in this book is to help articulate a new vocabulary or lexicon, a new shared vocabulary that can value and also explain to others the significance and necessity of this work. And this vocabulary is not only academic and theoretical, it's practical, and it has to operate at 3 different levels simultaneously, not separately, simultaneously. Being, which is to say the conditions of interdependency, world, all the relationships of articulated, and practices, everything that enables in thought and enables in actuality interdependence. So this is the kind of the task, in a way, that the book articulates this lexicon of possibility. And in fact, we could say, and I would be tempted to say, that this is the intellectual and more than intellectual task of our time. So this might be why it's very hard for our authors to write this book. But we will be very happy for them to have written this book once they have solved and articulated all these problems for us. But so that's my comment to that.
Thank you so much. Lot to think about. And the three of you will have a lot to respond to. I hope you took notes. Now I want to go now to Professor Christopher Chapple.
Okay, I want to send greetings. The mockingbirds are in full activity here in Southern California. And one of the nice things about the enclosure for this past year is that we all share greater intimacy with the movements of wildlife. And that's been such a blessing. Every morning, a murder of crows flies south at the rising of the sun. And at the setting of the sun, they move north. And sometimes I see them when I'm out and about. They have something going on. And I'm so glad to be in the company of design, philosophy, and science. And I want to tell a little story about Rupert Sheldrake. And a little story about what this book proposes to do, presenting a great threat to the status quo. And Rupert Sheldrake had developed through his observation, through hard science, the theory of the morphic field. That if enough people, the 100th monkey is another way to talk about this, but if enough people do something, all of a sudden it's just what is done. And he was giving a TED talk on this vis-a-vis psi phenomena. And I have to self-identify here that my mother was at Duke University with J.B. Rhine in the 1930s. And that was just accepted that, yeah, of course, people can know what other people are thinking. And that was a very active field of research. We know from William James a bit earlier, and we know from that work having continued. But then all of a sudden, there's actually a big fund at Stanford to keep this going, and it fell out of favor. And when Rupert Sheldrake gave a TED talk on this very possibility that the world is not fixed, he is now forever banned from TED Talks. So the work is important because it is subversive. I want to call out three things, and I could do 100, but I'm going to choose three. First, the choice of the word relationally and the articulation of relationality. And that is so critically important in terms of overcoming the pitfall of relativism. And I know that was conscious on the part of the authors, and relativism is one of the toxic byproducts of modernism. Second, I want to, as part of that project, applaud that it's a project of vision, not a project of cynicism. That implicitly, by doing the critique, by calling people's attention to the importance of social justice, and think of this past year, I mean, in three major ways: with the pandemic, with George Floyd, and with, here in California, the unrelenting fires. People are now grasping at meaning and understanding that cynicism truly is a dead end. It really becomes, meaning becomes a matter of life and death. And I wanted to lift up the darkness, okay? In the Ishopanishad, one must hazard the deepest darkness in order for transformation to take place. I'll just repeat that. I'm so happy that this was lifted up, I think it was in Kriti's essay, was that it's only through the dark that we learn who we are. It's only in the dark, and here I'm invoking Thomas Berry's reading of the Haudenosaunee peoples of Western New York State, my birthplace, where the dream life is primary. It's only in the darkness that we renew ourselves. It's only in the darkness that we renew our psyches. And one of the gifts, I'm like probably most of you, I'm in various reading groups. And one of them, where we're reading Kendi's work right now, sort of prompted me to go back and to read the autobiography of Frederick Douglass. And it brings the reader so graphically into the darkness of slavery, into the horrors of what it meant to literally escape with one's life. And that degree of relations and sorting out layers of complicity is utterly, utterly important. And I so appreciate the insistence in this book. Here I'm spilling over away from my promised three, but they're connected. So I wanted to lift up that part of the book that is an implicit critique of all things modern, an implicit critique of neoliberal, which is the latest sort of cool way to do the critique and point to the need for movement. But when, and I think some of you may have been there, we gathered for the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1999 in Cape Town. 1999, it was less than 5 years after the fall of apartheid. It was also the exact same time that the WTO met in Seattle. And if you remember, the nascent anti-fascists, all dressed in black, assailed the buildings in Seattle and grabbed all of the headlines. And Nelson Mandela came before us and said, I was supposed to be at the WTO. I canceled because the important conversation is going on here. And then he told a story that helped connect the Gandhian narrative, the movement narrative, and this signaling that is present in this writing toward the sacred. And he described his experience on Robben Island, more than 20 years imprisoned. And he said what sustained him, what gave him the courage. And as he described it, you could see it. And then we traveled to Robben Island and actually did see the ruins. And he said, it was the Hindu temple where I learned the Bhagavad Gita, Gandhi's Gita. It was the mosque where I learned the utter profundity and presence of, words fail, but that's what they're supposed to do. And then, as you know from reading his autobiography, he himself grew up simultaneously with traditional African initiation practices as well as Christian faith. But by calling out religion, he sent the message that it's only to the extent that we're able to connect, and here I'm invoking Thomas Berry, that we're able to connect with a coherent narrative, a story, making and restoring life, that we have any prospect for future. And it's been an encouraging week for a couple of reasons. The release of Bill Gates' book, and talk about change in public discourse when you have someone like Bill Gates just sort of laying it out, the extent of the change. And I want to end by inviting a reconsideration of the word design, okay? So we've been given all of these signs. We've been given all of these signs that this is what you're supposed to do. And what we need to do is to design. We need to move away. And here I'm invoking a little bit of Ortega y Gasset. We need to move away from the given world and reconfigure and re-engage and, in a sense, re-sign our individual and collective spirits moving forward. And I think the book is spot on with appealing to those who are drawn to abstractions by pulling down the abstractions, those that are drawn to transcendence by saying, no, it has to happen in the world, as Sri Aurobindo so vehemently emphasized, and that this really is the way forward in the most pluralistic sense of the word. So thank you. Great book.
Thank you so much. I have a few comments that were inspired by hearing all of you. And I would like to start with the idea that when we have the need to restory, to begin a new narrative, then I would suggest that we have to ask ourselves, why is this a struggle? The reason this is a struggle, and the reason, as Dr. Chapple said, that it is dangerous work, citing Rupert Sheldrake's Situation versus TED Talks, is that certain stories, narratives, universal visions, worldviews are deemed acceptable as meta-narratives by the hegemonic culture under which we live globally. All other stories and storying capacities are not considered valid means of knowing. They're not considered valid means of experiencing. They're not considered. Could everyone mute themselves? They're not considered valid epistemic trajectories. In other words, if we are to look forward to new narratives and new stories of who we are, why we're here, And what is our relationship with the biosphere, with the ecosphere? We have to ask, how can we go forward when globally we face epistemic injustice? Because that's what it is. Indeed, it is more than that. It is also epistemic violence. And as we have seen, the knowledge systems and the embodied knowing, the experiential knowing of First Nations in Canada, of Native peoples of the United States, of the Indigenous peoples all over the world, and indeed the entire cultural visions of the global South are not considered epistemologically valid. If you are facing a hegemonic, economy-based commercial structure that is telling you that you do not have validity to speak because your entire epistemic framework, the means by which you understand, perceive, cognize, process, and explain reality is invalid because it doesn't fit the dominant paradigm. So my question, I leave this with you, is how do we struggle against epistemic violence? Started in the started with Columbus on this continent, but it starts with imperialism and colonialism, then goes on to Orientalism and neoliberalism, and now neocolonialism. It just never stops. So to deal with that, because I believe it's a foundational, underlying structural problem that if we do not address, then everything we build will eventually be taken away because the foundation under our feet, which is that epistemic foundation, will be pulled off again and again. Thank you all the respondents as well. And I now turn it over to Arturo, Michal, and Kriti for your responses. We also are beginning to have some questions.
All right. We can certainly offer some commentaries on the commentaries. I don't think we have responses, but I wanted to ask Michal or Kriti if either of you want to start. I'd like to say something about the comments, but.
Go ahead, Arturo. We'll chime in.
Okay, thanks so much for the comments. It was so wonderful. Also, Rita's question that I just articulated so well. Ask ourselves, why is this struggle to tell a new story? And that reminds me, Chris mentioned Thomas Berry, and Thomas Berry has been an inspiration for us. And Thomas Berry's wonderful essay, The New Story, that begins by saying, we are in between stories. The old story is no longer working, it's destroying the earth, but we don't know yet what the new story is yet about. We have some clues, and I think that's what we are too as authors, and civilizationally, historically, a lot of people, the reason why we're thinking these ideas is because other people are thinking these ideas. There's no other way to see it. So this is wonderful. So just emphasize a few of the points that Clive made in re-articulating the book, the project, really wonderfully. That relationality is a condition of life. Yes, we're making a strong claim there, that's what life is about. Life is not about this separation that modernity has told us about. It is about radical independence. And then linking design and relationality. I really like the way in which I didn't get the name, but I think it's Elaine Scarry, maybe, that talked about rescuing making and restoring making itself, making life. And that's why we included that in the title of the book now, is making life. Making life has been taken away from people. We no longer make life. Life is made for us by expert systems, institutions, corporations, the state, etc., etc. So that's a very important concern as well. That all design is interface, and that's wonderful. And always thought that one of the main things that we can think about in design, and again, rethink, is interface design. And that we need a new philosophy and a new anthropology of interface design. In all interface, as Clive said, is negotiation, is interrelation, is exactly that. So that's also a wonderful idea. And maybe finally, not to take too long and leave time for Michal and Kriti and our people who have questions as well, that yes, we need a revolution in thought. And I wanted to signal that this is an idea that we've taken from a wonderful indigenous activist from the Mapuche nation, Moira Millán, says she, that she's saying, necesitamos una revolución del pensamiento. We need a revolution in thought because our thinking systems and our doing systems are leading us to terricide, as producing this condition she calls terricide, that is much more devastating than the Anthropocene, because it cannot be solved just through technological fix and managerial interventions. And then finally, yeah, we're very so aware that one of the greatest challenge is to think about rethinking the economy. And that's the big elephant in the room, that the economy is the most narrow-minded, close language, toxic language of modern life, along with the individual and the notion of believing in one single reality, one single world. And we have obviously partners and fellow travelers in how to rethink the economy is one of the main questions being dealt with today. People thinking about the commons, about alternative economies, about community economies. So all of those, that rethinking of the economy is also part of the book. Maybe emphasize one thing also of what Chris said, which is that yes, it is about subversion. It's the subversion in the last instance, the subversion of modernity, subverting the modern way of being. And I'll just end with this, which to me is a very provocative statement. You might remember that slogan that said, it is more difficult to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And sometimes it is more difficult to imagine the end of capitalism. No.
Yeah.
The end of the world at the end of capitalism.
No, it's the end of it's harder to imagine the end of capitalism than it is to imagine.
It is harder to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. Thank you. And so I now say it is harder to imagine. Let me see if I can get it correctly this time. It is harder to imagine the end of the world than the end of modernity. It's harder to imagine the end of modernity. I'm sorry. It's harder to imagine the end of modernity than the end of the world. It causes great anxiety, causes a fright among people to imagine the end of modernity. But even people like, and I like to quote this, especially in this space, Thich Nhat Hanh, the revered Buddhist teacher, who says in one of his books that that's what we have to do. We have to contemplate actively and meditate on the death of this civilization that centers so much on consumption and destruction and so forth. Okay, so again, thanks so much for the comments.
Kriti, do you want to go next? Okay. Wow, yeah, thank you both. And Rita too. This made it all just very exciting to hear it through your eyes. And I want to just comment on a few things, even though I could go on for a lot of them. And I just want to first say that one of the cool things for me is that we are teaching this material too. So a lot of this stuff, at least from my perspective, but I'm pretty sure it's true for Arturo and Kriti, is this class that we called Social Change in Times of Crisis, Knowledge, Action, and Ontology is a class that we started in 2011, and Arturo and I have taught it together 2 times, maybe 3 times. And then I've taught it many times since he's, not many times, but I've taught it continuously since he retired, and I'm currently teaching it. And we just did the econ unit this week. And the econ unit, the one where we talk about economocentrism and sort of try and name it as such. And one of the things that I've been commenting to Arturo and Kriti about is that it's really cool to watch my students sort of like, and I think it is because it is 2021 now and following on 2020, my students like recognize that like they have the desire for the world that we are trying to paint. And then they get into this moment of like, and they name it as such, like there's this cynic in them, the realist in them, right? And this week, one of the students was like, but what are you talking about? Like this version of reality, like me having to work this much to do this. She's a first gen college student, like lots of things. She's like, that is unrealistic, right? And so there's really, I think, something in the zeitgeist right now, experientially, that makes talking about this, Clive, I appreciate you naming the gargantuanity of what we're trying to do, which we've struggled with, but it also feels like something that's of a time, right? It's apropos of this time. And working with students, I mean, I've had a student describe to me in office hours how like, she came to office and she's like, in after your class, I don't really, she like did this body motion. She's like, I just don't know like how to be in the world. And it's fabulous, right? She was like happy about it, but she just was so disoriented, right? So it's like, it's fun to be doing this. And I just want to stress this because for me, it very much is a pedagogical process and practice. And I feel really grateful for the lessons I'm getting as I'm trying to discuss this stuff with my students. And so that actually speaks a little bit to the next point I wanted to make, and it goes to what Rita named about epistemic violence. And one of the moves that we're trying to build on, we're definitely not the origin, like the originators of it, is to name the fact that this epistemic violence happened and is happening in the West or the modern itself, right? And this is not to sort of say like we should care about it because that's what it's happening, but it's like there's a resonance because in particular, I think this year again, or in the last while, with like with the questions about what is real, right, going on with the Trump folks and the MAGAs and the QAnon and so many things, right? Like what is real has taken on this new sort of like, we can really see the different visions of reality sort of vying to exist, but we can also start to name the historical processes that, and there's an argument by this sociologist named John Law, who talks about the making of the one world, right? He talks about how there are many practices that go into consistently producing this one world, right? And this one world needs to be constantly produced because it is not, right? It is not the condition of being. And that one world, the creation of that depended on many very forceful, violent practices, like the colonization and enslavement of millions of people, the turning of women's knowledges and reproductive capacities into sort of just like labor or power over reproduction. This is specifically talking about Silvia Federici's work, but these things that happen, the enclosures of the commons, the primitive accumulation that led to what Marx talks about as capital wasn't simply in a material sense, although material and epistemology can't be separated. It was literally into creating a one story of how the world works, that as we've been trying to point to this notion of natural scarcity, which is another way to talk about like what we think of as economics, right? It came to be and is consistently, we need to maintain it, but maintaining that story requires ongoing violence. And this year now, not just this year, but in more recent years, I think it's harder and harder to maintain that because people are recognizing how unsustainable, how undesirable, and how utterly like violent the life that they are a part of is. And so you show that historically in terms of the making of the one world, but then consistently, right, in the present. And this last point that I'll say, even though I had 100 million things I could say, is the production of non-relationality or a-relationality or even anti-relationality, right? Like one of the things that we are really trying to show is that, the condition of life is relational. Even stories like white supremacy and liberalism that depend on the belief of like the autonomous individual, right? They depend on lots of relationships to make that story even viable for us, right? And so the making of that story is part of the story, right? But it required the banishment or annihilation of relational worlds, right? Very materially, right? And so we're trying to make visible that historically, but also in the present and how it continues to happen. And part of the work there, from my perspective, and we can talk about this because this is like some of the tricky territory we're in, is like, you don't want to go in and say like, we need to show those who are considered white, like that they're also a part of this, in the sense that you do want to show that, but you don't want to necessarily say, but it doesn't matter that we address racism, right? Like it's not about one or the other, but it is about sort of saying that whiteness and white supremacy are just as violent, or had been historically, to those who are supposed beneficiaries of it. And in fact, Ruby Sales, and I'll end here, who that was the woman who Clive pointed to her quote about the difference between the beloved community and integration. She's what called a public theologian, right? And she talks about the problem of whiteness as like white people hating white people, people of European descent, right? And it's like there needs to be a recognition of the fact that these annihilations of these other ways of being also are part of why we are in the predicament that we are. So the epistemic violence is so crucial, and it needs to be something that we address writ large, because what we are trying to also show, and this is the visionary or positive approach for us, is like, there you could focus on all the banishment, and you can focus on all the negative and all the destruction, but all the things that are relational, all the things that are, there's a parable that says all things shining are, right? Like you can focus on all the things that are not shining, but all things shining are. And if we start to like work with critique in that way, right? Also, because a big piece for us is that we are trying to really use theory in a different way, right? To make these worlds possible and seem not unrealistic or frivolous or naive or romantic, which are, often lobbed at us in this vein. Kriti.
Thank you. Just want to do a time check. Rita, are we good on time if it's 2 o'clock? Oh, so sorry, I can't hear you. You're muted.
We're fine. We have till 2:30.
Oh, okay, very good. I wasn't sure if it was 2 or 2:30. Thanks. Yeah, it's really generous of our respondents to have engaged this work so thoughtfully. It really brings so much more texture, and we've really enjoyed talking to each other about this, of course, but to have your perspectives is bringing really a lot to the project. And I am delighted, Clive, to hear you sort of, your framing of the book is just stellar. And I feel like I haven't thought about it in exactly the ways that you're articulating and laying out so beautifully. And I really want to incorporate a lot of what you're saying in terms of the way that you're putting forward this vision of the stakes in a way that I think are coming, or I guess later in some of these chapters, but the clarity with which you're talking about, particularly the ontological condition of relationality, is something that I'm excited to, is certainly going, or is in there, may not have appeared in the excerpts, but I think is very, very central. And this idea that we can't, it's what everything depends on and is not graspable, is not conceived, is not valued. And I think that was a wonderful word that you used. This revaluation and this bringing attention to, bringing consciousness to, as you said, in order to redesign, is a wonderful articulation. And I think this and it's so true that it is paradoxical. And a lot of where, of course, I get my inspiration around this, or part of my journey, has been directly through Buddhism. And so I would call this sort of not just our paradox, or but actually a sort of centuries old paradox, and a long, difficult problem about how, despite the fact that we see this in the modern episteme, that we have an anti-relational episteme. So on top of what Buddhists would call sort of an existential condition of tending to imagine the world to be made up of separate entities, but that being an illusion, on top of this being sort of an existential condition that from a Buddhist perspective may have preceded the modern episteme, our current condition is not having many guides or signposts, to use Christopher's wonderful reworking of design, that we don't have signs out. So that the Buddhists were trying to offer some sense of, despite the world looking this way, appearing as a place that is made up of independent entities and independent egos, that and independent selves, that actually there is no intrinsic existence, and there's no foundation to the bottom of the world. We're not just a bunch of billiard balls hitting each other and kind of making things happen. In fact, we bring each other into being and bring our worlds into being, which in turn brings us into being. And so that was an incredibly short summary of centuries of thought. But what I'm saying is there's that what we have is not only sort of the existential condition, but the lack of guides in a way. And I shouldn't even say that, not even a lack of guides, but it's kind of speaking to what Michal said, which is the cynic in the students, or the person who kind of says, the part of us that got there first, in a way, through our enculturation, and is therefore perhaps wants to believe, or something, wants to take what we might call a leap of faith, instead of seeing it as sort of an existential condition, as ontologically real, in the same senses that my computer is real, in the same sense that you and I are real. And so we call this, towards the end of the book, I think it's called Making Reality Real, or something like that, as in that it's not just a question, which sounds strange, but it's like, it's not about making a new world exactly, it's sort of revealing. And I think that this is where I appreciate this precedent from Buddhism of the work of philosophy, or the work of writing, the work of creation, the work of design, the work of speaking at all, is soteriological, or is towards salvation, that we don't just think about things because it's fun, or it's going to get us ahead, or we want to be clever, but because we really are working towards liberation, and we want to liberate ourselves from obscurations. We want to liberate ourselves from notions that keep us trapped in a small sense of ourselves and keep us harming each other. And so I think that this idea that and this is what I'm interested in sort of thinking with you all about, or in terms of the lab meeting aspect of it. It's no small task, but and so sometimes we get stuck. But I love that there are so many people, that we're part of kind of an ecosystem of people who are all just like trying. We don't know what we're doing exactly, but we are all putting forward some ways of thinking, in the hopes of, again, not just being cute, not just being clever, but in the hope of trying to liberate ourselves and each other from some really foundational and difficult, I guess one might say, delusions, or kind of harmful assumptions. And so I'm excited to be part of trying to do that with many people. I'm reminded of cell biologists who talk about exploratory behavior, or how in times of difficulty, a lot of organisms or cells will kind of try anything once. So put out a lot of tendrils and then see what works and what sticks. So a neuron will find another neuron this way by putting out a bunch of its tendrils. And then when it finds one to attach to, it'll stick to it, or this is how grapevines grow, or ants find new ant trails. And I see us as sort of engaging in that kind of exploratory behavior as well. And yes.
Sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I'm not trying to interrupt, but we just to be careful about our time, I want to get some questions from the audience, and one of them actually connects with what you just said about the ant trails. So let me read that to you and see if you'd like to respond to that. The question is, how does designing relationally reconcile the human longing for incessant activities of production, which is not seen among other sentient beings? How do you redeem other sentient beings into this paradigm of designing, besides offering the critique and showing the flaws in the current modes of thought?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And I wish we were sort of face to face so I could kind of ask a follow-up, because I don't know that I understand all of the nuances. So I'm happy to
I think it's a matter
again.
of, to understand how we are related, not in just a kind of a abstract way to the ecosphere, but how are we to integrate what we know about other sentient beings and how they react to their environment in the work of redesigning and restoring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that reframing. I think about this a lot because I turn my mind, I guess what we would call more than human species. And I think, so there's so much happening. I always think of it as sort of a shuttle that's going back and forth between us, in that, for example, I see this in my field of microbiology, where we'll look towards, let's say, bacteria, and we're kind of asking a question of the world. How are bacteria decomposing something? And then what comes back when we ask that question is who we think we ourselves are. So for example, I see scientists sort of framing the question of how are bacteria decomposing things by saying things like, well, they put out these enzymes, which then become public goods. And but how do they privatize the benefit of these public goods? Why are they just putting things out there for free? And so the biological literature is full of words like selfish, cheater, privatize, public goods, tragedy of the commons, none of which are exactly, like, no bacteria has any of this written on them. We're the ones who are writing this whole story. And so we end up with a vision of bacteria as Bacillus economicus in the way that we see ourselves as Homo economicus. But then we look to Bacillus economicus, or the economic bacterium, as proof that we are ourselves naturally sort of humanly economic. There it is in nature, so that means that we must be this way. And this loop, or the shuttle, is really pernicious, because there's a way in which we're not really relating with sentient beings who are not human. We're not relating with each other even, but we're also not relating with organisms who we think of as, not human, because we're not people, because we're not really able to be with them in a way that is sort of beyond our, what I would call like primate anxieties or something like this. And so so I think one question really is, because it's not a trivial question of how to learn from other beings, and how to expand our own minds about who they are. And some of how, I guess, we have this wonderful kind of group of heterodox biologists here at Caltech who meet once in a while. And one way we'll try to kind of expand our minds about this is literally try and change our metaphors. So we might actually take a word from a poem that we just randomly went to, a card from a tarot deck, and we might ask ourselves, how is a cell like this? How is an ant like this? How is, and part of the exercise is to say that we are always using our own stories to describe organisms around us. And so how could we because the explanatory horizon for what life might be like is very vast. that a cell could be like a computer, it could be like a factory, and these are the metaphors that we've used so far to describe biological systems. It could be like an economic being, but it could also be like a rainbow or a pressure cooker, or it could be like a star. So that we try to really be capacious, as Clive was saying before, sort of quoting Michal, allowing our concepts to be bigger than they are now.
In relation to what Clive was saying before, and thank you, Kriti, that's a wonderful response. I have another question from our audience, and that is, this is an inquiry about the idea of in other words, the question is about terminology. It says the Anthropocene is considered a negative term in theological ethics and of the world we inhabit here at the GTU. If our terminology is not expansive enough to contain newer and bigger conceptions of reality and our role in it, how do we expand it if we do not acknowledge the significance of the vocabulary from other cultures and worldviews, which might be a good source for new terminology and the concepts that it carries? Anyone?
I can take a stab, Arturo, unless you want to say something.
Huh?
Go ahead, and then I will.
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the things, and this goes actually to part 2 of my answer to you also about epistemic violence, is that one of the things that this book is centered on is actually drawing on other concepts, like other concepts from other civilizational matrices or other cultures, partly because we believe that in the creation of the one world, we have lost a lot of a great importance, right? And we also believe, and this, people accuse us of being romantic again, but we also believe that those who have been oppressed epistemically, ontologically, and materially, and they're all interconnected, are more able to both define the dominant and explain this thing that exceeds it, right? And so we look for concepts and practices from elsewhere, and we really center those, in particular from social movements, from indigenous peoples, many of which you've named, from Buddhism and other traditions. And we're kind of like weirdly eclectic in this, and we know that this might get some pushback, but it's partly how we come to have challenged some of these things. And I will say, that being said, one of the things we keep coming up against and is the limitations of any concept, right? Because we in the West assume a concept's like capaciousness, but we think it's going to translate to something like truly, as opposed to just being a tool to get to another idea, like the limitation of concept in and of itself. And we've talked about this, and all 3 of us have a meditation and like a spiritual, for lack of a better word, practice. And part of it has helped us to understand that, right? That the more we try to name the thing, it's great, it's important. We have to see, name, and own, but then we can't cling to the concept, right? And one of the other thoughts is that relationally, or relationality, for political concepts and for the new lexicon, and I'm really excited that you like that, Clive, because we have been talking about this new lexicon for like probably as long as we've talked about relationality, so, and beyond, before actually with Social Movement Working Group too, but that you want to name these terms, and in political context you want to enable these other visions, and you want to be like, okay, but don't assume that it's going to work in every context in the same way, because that's another part of relationality, is that it is contextual, it's contingent, and there's no purity and there's no perfection. Just like, I think it was Clive who mentioned the no perfection, right? Like the nature of the concept has to work relationally as well. And so, in a given context, you might be fighting against something that in another context would be not appropriate, right? So you can't take, for example, the word justice to have this one definitive positive meaning without understanding its contextual contingent reality, relational reality, right? So, but I do think the concepts coming from other worlds, other cultures, other experiences are absolutely, and this is partly why I lifted up this idea that we believe that social movements and other are experts, right? We really, part of our process is also de-centering and sort of making multiple knowledge sites visible to each other, so that in the web of translation, but again, with this translation of an assuming that you might never quite know exactly what that other word meant, right? But you can try, just like Kriti and her scientists do with the cell, you can try and be like, so if we use that metaphor, right? Like try on what it does and how it feels too, what it does in the world and to you.
And I will leave you with one word, and that is a word from Jaina Dharma or Jainism, Anekantavada, which means, Chris, you want to take that away?
Yes, that was on my list of probably item 15. But in Jain thought, everything is said to be a Naya. Everything is said to have its own path and lead us in a particular direction. And in accounting for, quite literally, trying to count things up, the number one is never sufficient. So therefore, un negates ek, anta, the idea that there's one thing that will be with us forever. So this multi-perspectivalism is joined with an inviolable emphasis on the dignity of the individual that is beyond the ego, okay? Not the Western ego-based individual, but this ray of awareness. And to be able to negotiate even the difference between, say, the Advaita, where like, oh, everything is one, or the Buddhist, well, there really is no, and we understand the utility, certainly, of saying, well, it doesn't last forever, but to make sure that that doesn't spin off into a cynicism, there's this commitment to celebrating the pluralism found within the world and celebrating the perspective held by this living, breathing being. So anekanta, yeah, that's, thank you, Rita.
We have just a few minutes left. I want to just mention a couple of things, and that is that it's just, our classes read Arturo's works, and they have been for a long time. And so they're thoroughly conditioned by the deconditioning of his work. So it's a pleasure to have him. It's wonderful to have met you, Kriti and Michal and Clive. Wonderful to have had you here for your wisdom as always, Chris. I want to end with the Anekantavada in the sense of, let this not be the one time we meet. And may we meet again soon. And I will send you all the information for our forthcoming conference on March 19th. And I hope that you'll be able to make some of the sessions.
Thanks so much, Rita. Again.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, we're going to be thinking and meditating on this for a long time.
Yes.
Yeah.